My name is Clarice Raza Sharif, and I'm the Director of Literary Programs at PEN America. I'm trying not to shout too much. We are honored to participate every year at the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is a true highlight of a fall literary season in New York City. Many thanks to Carolyn, Liz, and my colleagues from the Brooklyn Book Festival Literary Council for such an amazing lineup of events. I'm biased, I think we have the best event, but that's another story. Today, we are thrilled to be in the company of journalists and writers who are on the front lines in the fight for a free press, an essential pillar of a true democracy. At PEN America, we insist on placing literary expression at the core of what we do year-round to protect the freedoms, or the freedom to write, and make it possible at home and abroad. Our strength is in our membership. It's a nationwide community of novelists, journalists, editors, poets, playwrights, screen and teleplay writers, publishers and translators, etc. It's a community, and here one thing that I wanted to make sure that I tell you is to invite you to join us. If you want to learn more about PEN America, you can visit the booth 355 to learn more. You'll see me, you'll see my colleagues, ask us a lot of questions. So before we get started, a few quick notes. The book signing will follow this discussion here right outside after the Q&A. We'll try to get to the Q&A, but we're short on time, but let's see how it goes. Questions should be collected on index cards, so if you have a burning questions, please wave your index card and we'll collect it. And then finally, silence your phones, right? So now, let's help me welcome our guest. Jami Floyd, our moderator, is the host of All Things Considered on WNYC. Suzanne Nossel is our CEO of PEN America. Jim Acosta, CNN's chief White House correspondent and the author of The Enemy of the People. Reid, host of AM Joy and author of The Men Who Sold America. So now let's get started.
Welcome to you all. Thank you for coming out to support PEN America, to support journalism and freedom of the press on a beautiful day, I might add. And I'm going to begin, our time is short, I'm going to begin by asking each of our panelists a rapid fire question. And they're used to that. I don't know if they're used to being on the receiving end. Each of you, what is the single biggest threat to freedom of the press today? And I'm asking you to pick one single biggest threat. We're going to take a deeper dive in the course of our time this afternoon. But Joy, I'll start with you. The single biggest threat to press freedom.
Well, first of all, thank you, PEN America, for having us as well. And I would say the answer to that, Jami, is it's a one answer, but it's fear/intimidation. Because I think what's happening both here and in autocratic systems around the world, thinking Russia, thinking Saudi Arabia, is that journalists are not being protected. And I add intimidation to it because you also have one political side in this country that's attempting to frighten journalists and intimidate them away from telling the full truth about what's happening with the administration. So whether it's actual fear that what happened to Jamal Khashoggi can happen to you and that you won't be protected by this government, or the fact that the full weight of the government and their supporters are being turned against you, I think those are the biggest threats to a free and open press, both abroad and here, unfortunately, in the United States.
Suzanne.
Well, I agree with that, but I don't want to give the same answer. But I completely agree with Joy, and that's why PEN America is suing the President of the United States, challenging his acts against journalists and the media, because we believe he's trying to do just that and that he has to be stopped. I'll add one thing to the conversation, though, that worries me, because I think that press freedom cannot be separated from the role of the press and having a vibrant press that plays its role, holding our government institutions accountable. And so, what worries me on top of that is the crisis of truth in our country, and the fact that when the president says that the press is the enemy of the American people, the title of Jim's book, that 40% of Republicans, at least according to recent surveys, believe him, and that they believe that the mainstream media, credible reporting, serious journalists like the folks up here on this stage, cannot be trusted, and they turn to alternative sources, and that is eroding our discourse, the kind of fact base that we use to make decisions as a society, as a polity, to cast our vote at the ballot box, and I think that's very frightening, and I'm not sure quite how we get that back.
I mean, I would just add to what Joy and Suzanne were saying. I mean, I think Joy started this off perfectly. I mean, I think that the ultimate enemy of the press is tyranny. If you have tyrannical governments that are seeking to silence the press, obviously that does damage to the pursuit of the truth, which is what Suzanne was talking about. But I think there's a third component to it, and that is complacency. When citizens get complacent, when they don't hold leaders accountable for going after the press and going after the truth, there is responsibility among citizens as well. And one of the things that I raise from time to time is, where are our elected leaders? I mean, people can dump on Trump all they want, but if there are members of Congress who are not standing up for the press in this country, there aren't elected leaders up in Washington standing up for the press in this country, then we have big problems on our hands.
I want to come back to the lawsuit, PEN America versus Trump, in just a moment. I want to talk about each of these spheres more deeply as we move along. But I also want to talk specifically about what you've written in these two excellent books. Let's start, Joy, with your book that you published in June. The Man Who Sold America, Trump and the Unraveling of the American Story. Now, as far as I know, President Trump was silent for a couple of months at least, I think, unless I missed it. But then he got around, not surprisingly, and I almost hate to give him the oxygen, but he then tweeted, just this week, I think, at you, about you. It does raise, though, a critically important point. How seriously should we take the president's persistent denigration of the press?
Yeah.
How dangerous is it?
Well, first of all, it's funny because my sister's name is June. So growing up, and my brother's name is Orange, so I was always June, June or Joy, because my mother would actually call each of us to get me. So when you said June, I almost answered you.
But you are Joy-Ann.
I'm Joy-Ann, yes. Well, and it's interesting that my name was spelled right in that tweet, so I think that is that's great. I wasn't surprised. Name was spelled right. People missed the Y in the Joy-Ann.
But am I right? There was no comment when the book came out in the spring.
Well, the president. I've read a lot of biographies of his, not just the one that I wrote, is more of a TV guy than a books guy.
Fair enough.
So I doubt that he's read the book. I don't think he's read Jim's book. He talks a lot about Jim, but he is a TV-based person. Donald Trump, in many ways, is the Fox News audience. He's sort of a retired person who plays golf and watches a lot of TV. And so he gets a lot of the information. I don't mean that as pejorative. I think he just watches a lot of television. That's where he gets a lot, if not all, of his information, rather than, say, from his intelligence services, et cetera. But I think when he directly attacks individual people, I think there are two almost opposite results of that. On the one hand, the idea of someone using the magisterial power of the presidency to attack one individual citizen in the United States is actually the ultimate in intimidation. It's the ultimate, it's beyond cyberbullying. It's not a be best moment. It's actually a crisis moment. Because if the previous president, or any previous president, I think of the Trayvon Martin case when George Zimmerman was on trial, President Obama was loath to say anything that might prejudice the case from that position, that high position, the highest, the only person elected in theory to represent the entire United States, not a state, not a city, but the entire United States. To train that power on one person is actually, in a sense, the ultimate way to intimidate and try to silence an individual member of the country. So in a way, it's the ultimate intimidation. On the other hand, unfortunately, this president, because of the way he governs himself, has made the presidency so small that actually when he beats up on someone on Twitter, it's not any different than any average troll. So it's both incredibly intimidating from the office, but in a sense, it's much less meaningful because of who's doing it and the fact that he essentially lives as a troll. So it made me a bit sad for the shrinking of the presidency, that he's sort of reduced to just another troll. And then the last thing I'll say is, to the first point we were making, part of the way this president is able to try to intimidate people who criticize him or who report on him, people like Jim who do the factual reporting. I'm an opinion journalist. Jim is doing the brave work of actually just straight reporting and not opinion, but he sees us as doing the same job. But part of his power, his negative power, is to unleash other people and to unleash a tribe of followers who behave toward him as if he is a religious leader, and if his edicts are things they should not just listen to and enjoy as trolling, but maybe follow. And so he has the unleash to unleash potentially violent people against you.
And
That
he
we
has.
hear, and he has, and if you think of what Michael Cohen testified to, it's not that he's telling you to do the wrong thing, but you get the impression. And so unfortunately, while he is merely a troll, unfortunately, and not the president of the United States in the traditional sense, the people who follow him, some of whom are frightening, some of whom are neo-Nazis, some of whom have come at, I'm sure Jim has gotten it too as a person of color, in the ugliest, most racist, in my sense, most misogynistic ways. And you just never know when somebody who starts out as a troll becomes actually a violent murderer. We've seen people actually killing and naming the President of the United States as their inspiration. That has never happened in this country to my knowledge.
And that is why I asked you about the danger.
Yeah, it is dangerous because of the people who have taken their belief in him to be an almost religious experience, almost a cult of personality, in the sense that they view everything he says as the gospel, as being of God, of him saying of himself that he is of God, that he was placed in office by God. And so people who believe in him in that way, we've already seen people adorn a van with all of his enemies, many people in the press and many Jewish people, many donors, and adorn their van with people that they then threaten and then send bombs to, or shoot up an entire Walmart because supposedly Mexicans are invading what used to be Mexico, Mina, Texas. And so this can happen, and so in that sense, it's frightening in the back of my mind, but sadly, it has made me lose the sense that the office of the presidency has a grandeur to it.
And as you said, it has become small.
Yeah.
And yet, Suzanne, as I listen to Joy talk about this, I'm confronted, as I am each day, with the challenge we face as journalists in covering the presidency through Twitter, through tweets. Which ones do we cover? Do we cover them all? Do we cover none of them? It is a unique moment for us as journalists, not just because of this president, but of course because he is this president, but also because of the changing nature of what we do in this moment with social media at the fore. Your thoughts on that?
No, I think you're right. I think the transition to social media, it's not just a new medium. It's a transformation of society in ways that we're still only coming to grips with. And when you look at the First Amendment, we as a free speech organization are very hesitant to say that Twitter should shut him down or that certain tweets should be deleted from the platform. Traditionally, that's not something we would have ever supported. That's just our idea. Our premise, our mission is open discourse. He's the most powerful man in this country. The idea that we ought to know what is on his mind and what he's expressing, and yet at the same time, he's our troll in chief. And so those tweets can be incredibly disruptive, misleading. They can pollute our discourse. They can confuse and confound people. And we're thinking a lot about that in the context of the next election. When now we're on notice that disinformation played. We don't know if it's a decisive role, but it's a significant role in 2016. That's documented. We know there are a series of threats that have become more sophisticated over the last few years, including deep fakes, videos that have such verisimilitude that it's almost impossible to prove them false. If that comes out in the context of our next election, he could tweet it out, anyone could tweet it out, it could go viral. If it's on the eve of an election, it may be impossible to disprove in time for people to go to the polls based on accurate information. They may be misled. So it is a frightening time. I think we need to be a lot more aware and cognizant, the mainstream media and the tech platforms, about how we deal with less than credible information, particularly in the election context, because there's a target on the back of our democracy right now.
Yeah. Now, speaking of that target, Joy tipped her hat to your work in the briefing room.
Yeah.
The White House briefing room, you're there doing the good work that you do. The critically important work, it's always been critically important work, but I would argue no time more than now. And you're doing that work, and then last November, I think it was, your pass is revoked.
Right.
And you and CNN together sue to get it back. Now, I'm gonna guess that everybody in this room knows this story, but why don't you just remind us how that case was resolved, and more importantly, the First Amendment and Fifth Amendment grounds on which you brought the suit, and how important it was that it be resolved the way it was resolved, because as you write, if it had gone a different way, we'd be sitting in a very different moment at this time.
I think we'd be in big trouble right now, and just to, I think expand on what Suzanne and Joy have been saying, and they've been very articulate about all of this. I'll do my best, but I'll take you back to that day. It was right after the midterms. We knew the president was not going to be in a good mood. He had just gotten beaten pretty badly. There was a blue wave. Even remember that night, on the night of the midterms, people were saying, well, maybe we shouldn't call it a blue wave. It was a blue wave. The House went to Democratic hands, and he came in and he was in a bad mood. And the question that I wanted to ask about, because I was out on the campaign trail and I saw him doing this on a daily basis, was to ask him about this lie that this caravan of migrants heading towards the border amounted to an invasion, going back to what Joy was just saying a few moments ago. I mean, remember, that language is what in part motivated this shooter in El Paso. So as it turns out, it was a pretty important question at the time. Not patting myself on the back, but I wanted to confront him on that, and almost immediately he didn't like the question. You could see in the book, I try to do this in certain parts throughout the book. I put the transcript so you could see, the reader can see, how many words I get out in my question before he starts interrupting and attacking me. It happens almost every time. And then in the middle of all this, you saw the intern coming in, trying to get my microphone, getting back to what Suzanne, we all remember the microphone, but getting back to what Suzanne was saying about deep fakes, this was sort of one of the first deep fakes. It was sort of a crude deep fake, I guess, where they sped up the video, they doctored the video in a tweet that was sent out by Sarah Sanders, the White House press secretary, the karate chop that never was, and so on. But I remember leaving the White House that day, going to get some dinner that evening, and coming back and looking at the lock screen on my phone, and it says, it wasn't a message to me, it was to the whole world, from Sarah Sanders saying that my press pass had been taken away. And all of a sudden my eyes are kind of glazing over. I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm in trouble now. And the thing that occurred to me at that moment is I should get my phone out and start documenting everything. Just get it on video. When the Secret Service came over, asked for my press pass, I handed it over, so that's why you saw the video of me handing over my press pass. But fortunately, CNN did not waver. Our new parent company at that time, AT&T, did not waver. We decided to take the administration to court. And just to fast forward to some of the key moments in all of this, yes, there was a Fifth Amendment problem in that they took my press pass away without giving me any kind of due process. So that gets to the Fifth Amendment part of this. But in terms of the First Amendment, I think that it was largely overlooked what went on in that courtroom. Justice Department lawyers paid for with your tax dollars, working on behalf of the Trump administration, argued in federal court in front of a federal judge that the White House can essentially pick and choose who covers the Trump administration. That if they don't like what you're writing or what you're saying, they can come over and say, hey buddy, you're out of here. And what started off as, look at Jim with the microphone, and will he get his press pass back? And isn't this fun to talk about? It sort of mushroomed into this, I thought, very significant First Amendment case. And had we lost, I don't think it's a stretch to say that mayors and governors and other parts of the country could come in and say, you know what, we don't like this newspaper, we don't like this TV station, we don't like what this guy's doing over here, you're out of here. And fortunately, it all worked out in our favor. But look at what the outcome of that was. Even though they were towel-snapped by a judge that was appointed by the president, they tried it once again with my colleague Brian Caron. They tried to take his press pass away. So this is a concerted effort by this president. He knows exactly what's going on. He's concurring with these decisions to take press passes away, and this administration to try to silence and put a chilling effect on the press in this country to affect and shape the coverage. And people might say, well, this sounds like something out of 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale, or this sounds like a dystopian nightmare. I don't want to take it to that level, but the United States government is trying to affect the coverage of the presidency by intimidating journalists, and that is what is happening in this country right now. It's one of the big reasons why I wrote the book.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're writing the book
Yeah.
because you want us to, if we're not already awake, get woke.
The public has a right to know about this. The public has a right to know about those efforts, and the other thing that, you know, we sort of struggled with as I was putting this book together is how much should the public know about these threats that Joy was talking about. One of the things that happened just before my press pass was taken away was a man, a Trump supporter, sent a pipe bomb to CNN, sent it to various Democratic officials around the country. When they arrested him in that white van covered in anti-media signage, they went into his social media accounts. They had found at that time that he was sending death threats to me. One of those death threats said, "You're the enemy of America, you're next." And one of the tweets attached to it was a picture of a decapitated goat's head. And so we're now to the point of what Joy was saying earlier, where the rhetoric can activate and inspire people to do bad things. And I'm not saying the president is directing people to harm other journalists or whatever, but we have to understand words have meaning, words have power. We try to, you know, impress that upon the people at the White House. It's fallen on deaf ears.
Power has power.
That's right, that's right.
And yet, as Suzanne points out, when the president calls the press the enemy of the people, a significant portion of his supporters agree. Are those people beyond the reach of the mainstream media outlets like CNN, NBC, and MSNBC? Or are you still hopeful in writing this book that some of those folks can be brought back to fact-based reporting and journalism and information and conversation and dialogue like this?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that, you know, this is going to take some time. You know, I try to get my story out there so people can read it and see what happened to us and understand what's going on. But that is a question that I asked towards the end of this book.
Right.
How can the system of, you know, disseminating information in this country, that is the press, the mainstream news media, how can it make it through this time if half of the country is unwilling to accept what we're reporting on a daily basis because the President of the United States, his apologists, his propagandists, and so on are telling those folks not to believe what we're saying. I mean, you know, a third of the country still supported Richard Nixon after he resigned in disgrace. So, you know, this is going to take some time. Donald Trump could leave the scene in 2021. It may take years, it could take a decade before I think people will start to understand in time that we have gone down the wrong path to some extent. And you know, one of the stories I tell very quickly, and I don't want to monopolize the time, is, you know, towards the end of the book, I talk about the midterms. This gentleman came up to me at one of these Trump rallies and said to me, "Jim, I want to apologize for something." And I said, "Oh, okay, hang on a second, let me get my phone out, I want to record this one too." And he goes, "Jim, I just want to apologize for giving you the middle finger at a rally that Trump had earlier in the summer." And it's, you know, maybe it's a small thing, maybe it's an insignificant thing, but it said to me at that moment that people understand that this behavior is regrettable. And over time, not all Trump supporters, but some of them understand, you know, maybe we've taken this too far and maybe we are all on the same team, you know, and there is something to be said to that.
And we see what's happening with Walmart and ammo and
That's right.
sales of assault weapons.
That's right.
Companies coming around to at least say to their consumers, we are going
I
to
think
do
these
the right
moments-
thing in
right.
some areas.
These moments of clarity will come at different
Yeah,
times for
yeah.
everybody. Yeah.
Suzanne, we are talking about litigation, so let's talk about Pan America v. Trump.
Yeah, sure. So we actually filed this lawsuit before Jim's press pass was withdrawn. We filed it in October of last year, so coming up on a year ago. And we did so out of concern about exactly what Joy was talking about, which is that the idea that the president is using the power of the federal government to threaten and retaliate against journalists and media organizations as a way of casting a chill and intimidating reporters from going out and doing their jobs and forcing everybody who covers the president and the White House, the administration, to have, at least in the back of their mind, the idea that if it's too hard-hitting, if it hits too close to home, if it's too irksome and nettlesome in a press conference, that he might slap them down. And whether that's through the withdrawal of a press pass or some form of retaliation against the owner, the media company in question, we saw that pattern, and we believe that pattern violated the First Amendment. Now, the president is free to say he can tweet about Joy, and Jim, and he can even call the press the enemy of the American people, as damaging and wrongful as I believe that is. But he cannot, under the First Amendment, use the machinery of government to threaten or exact retaliation against the media. So we believe that's a clear legal line, and we filed a case just about a year ago. We've had to amend it and write several letters to the court over time because of new incidents, Jim's incident, Brian Karam, and other things that have happened that have substantiated the notion that this is a playbook that the president is operating from in an effort to discredit the media, to deter critical coverage. And it's great that Jim's case and Brian Karam's case turned out the way they did. We turned to our courts, and thank God they upheld the First Amendment and press freedom. And we hope that we'll get a successful result in our case as well, because if these actions were allowed to stand, Jim's absolutely right. Every official across the country would be picking and choosing who gets to cover them and drawing lines about what can and can't be said. And that would destroy the role of the free press in our country. So we think the stakes are very high with this. I want to add one thing about trust in the media, just a piece of this crisis that we are focused on that unfortunately is kind of coming right at the same time as everything else we're talking about, which is the crisis in local news. And we're preparing a report on this. 20% of local news outlets across the country have shuttered over the last, I think, 10 or 12 years. For those that remain, reporting staffs have been cut by more than 50%. It's mostly an economic issue. But if you question people about where they place the most trust in terms of media, it's local media. And so the fact that this crisis is coming right at the same time as these attacks from the top and the kind of authoritarian effort to curb press freedom and undercut trust in the press, I think just makes what would be a crisis an even worse one.
We've mentioned Brian Karam several times. You can follow him on Twitter, at Brian Karam. Playboy, isn't he Playboy's White House correspondent?
He was, I think.
He was, is he no longer? He's on Twitter. He actually tweeted out this event several times today, even though he could not be here because he's in Washington, D.C. All of us can be supported on Twitter if you enjoy the work that we do and support the First Amendment journalism that we're doing, the work that we're doing to bring you important news and journalism. Joy, I want to move on, but I want to ask you one more question about the book. You said when it came out in June that this book is intended as a history and a plea. How is it a history and how is it a plea?
Well, I would say it's a history in the sense that, and Jim goes through this, I'm sure, as well, is that we are in the fire hose. We're sort of at the end of a fire hose. And every day, Donald Trump is doing 10, 20 things and tweeting 10, 20 things that each start to shift the news cycle. I mean, I do a weekend cable news show in the morning. People should be asleep. But instead, people are up watching, and we're trying to craft a show that we have to change 2 and 3 times because he's breaking news on weekends. No one ever broke news on weekends. No president did. But they're breaking news on Saturdays and Sundays. And some of them are things that could really damage and threaten human beings. I mean, the things they're doing to migrant children, the fact they they are so horrific, but a week or 2 later, we're not even talking about them anymore. Mass shootings, cut down 40, 50 people. We're horrified for literally one day, and then the next day the fire hose hits us again. And we just keep getting hit and hit and hit. And we are watching an unprecedented level of cruelty, an unprecedented level of hatred being unleashed by the president. I mean, we've had horribly racist presidents before, but I don't remember a history of Andrew Johnson, Andrew Jackson, Woodrow Wilson, even Richard Nixon, who was apparently drinking and threatening, maybe to hit the button to save himself. None of these people ever used the presidency to actually inspire hatred. I interviewed the Southern Poverty Law Center's leader that writes the report that they do on hate crimes, who noted that the peaks in hate crimes in this country came during Democratic administrations. When there's a Democrat in office, people get afraid the black helicopters are coming. It goes up during Clinton. It skyrockets when the first black president, President Obama, is elected. But now it's the highest it's ever been. And people on the far, far, far right refer to Donald Trump as the God Emperor and see him as their leader, whether he sees himself as their leader or not. So this fire hose is coming at us every day. So I, wanted to just write a nice history book about the civil rights era. But then when I sat down with my team, my team at HarperCollins and my book agent, I said, you know what, we all agreed that I wanted to write a book so that even I could just remember everything that happened. Because it's so hard to remember a month later the horrible things that happened a month before. So that's the history, that I want to just remember it. I want to remember how it happened, and I want people to have the opportunity to just remember this is how we got here, and that this isn't normal, that this is a very abnormal situation. The plea is that Americans, I think, take for granted that we are the greatest democracy in the history of mankind. We're the youngest democracy in the history of mankind. The only country of similar age in history is South Africa. And I do a whole chapter in the book about South Africa because I think it's the country that we can learn the most from, because it's a country born in enslavement and Europeans discovering a country that was already there and deciding that people they found would be great laborers, they just didn't want to pay them. So they enslaved them and then imported people from Malaysia and enslaved them to create a system of slavery and then a system of segregation that in South Africa lasted from 1948 to 1990. And how it lasted was that the political party of white Afrikaners at the time, the National Party, called itself a Christian nationalist party. It rooted segregation in the belief in Jesus Christ, believe it or not. It rooted what it was doing in religion, and it enjoined its supporters to not believe that the people who were not white and Afrikaner and did not speak the Afrikaner language were not quite people. They were somewhat less than human. We see the same thing having been done to black people and now being done to brown people, and it will get to everyone else as well. The idea of exclusion from being able to work, exclusion from being able to live freely, that was all done by a political party that no one would stand up to, even when other members thought it was horrifying what they were doing to black Africans in South Africa. And the ability of people to look away at horror, to look away at atrocities, to look away even at mass murder, as long as they have power, is what drove the national, sometimes called the nationalist party in South Africa. And I think Americans believe that we are invincible as a democracy, but they don't realize democracy is fragile. And what's even more fragile than democracy itself is multiracial democracy. South Africa was only 9% white, but they managed to achieve minority rule over 91% of the population. And they did it through the same tactics that you're seeing the current Republican Party using in the United States. They are also executing minority rule. It's already minority rule right now. The Republican Party's been a numerical minority versus the Democrats for decades. But they've managed to find a way to use the courts, as the Nationalist Party in South Africa did, to use religion, to use hate, to use fear, and to use the fear of white South Africans and now some white Americans in order to keep power. And that lasted from 1948 to 1990. If people think that this democracy is just gonna sail through Trump and that when he's gone, we're just gonna fix it back and have a normal president and sort of a Bob Dole will be in there, that is not how it works. It's not how it's worked anywhere in the world, and there's nothing different about the United States. Donald Trump, if he's done one thing, he's proved that American exceptionalism was a wonderful myth, but we're an ordinary country. We can have an autocracy too.
So since I asked you about
We're a cool country. I'm not saying we're not cool, but I'm saying we are ordinary in the sense that anything bad that's happened all over the world can happen here.
Since I asked you about history and plea, and Jim, you also, I wouldn't call these alarmist books, but these are wake-up calls.
Yeah.
Right? Is that fair? This is a wake-up call.
Yeah,
And we're going into 2020.
I'm alarmed personally, but go on to.
Alarmed. We're alarmed. So we're going into 2020. And I have a time, I'm getting a time, and I've got a lot of my questions. I got a lot of questions, so I'm going off script. So as we go into 2020, I don't want to just talk about President Trump. So as citizens, and citizen journalists, what is the single most important thing for us to be doing? I'm going to go this way, and then if we have more time, I'll take some of those questions on the cards.
Yeah. Well, I just to play off of what Joy was saying, I mean, one of the questions I've been trying to ask folks recently is, do you remember, and there are folks who are about my age or a little older, when we were growing up in this country, our parents and our grandparents would say, I want to pass on to the next generation a better country than the one that we have right now. And the question that I ask, and I think it's one of the questions at the heart of my book, is does anybody really ask that question are we in the process of handing off to the next generation a better country than the one that we have right now? Because my sense of it is that we're not. If we're at a place right now where it's acceptable for the president to refer to the press as the enemy of the people, the question that you have to ask is which segment of American society is next after he's finished calling us the enemy? I am not your enemy, you are not my enemy. It is not right to refer to your fellow Americans as the enemy of the people. And I think if we are going to have that more perfect union, I think we have to try to figure out a way to get to a better kind of politics in this country, where we're not ripping each other to shreds. We're just at a place right now where people are so politically and emotionally invested in the current leadership right now that I am afraid that bad things are going to continue to happen. It's not a worry about may or may not bad things happen. They're already happening. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, and this is to folks who are about my age or older than myself, is what are you doing to make sure that we're handing off to our kids and our grandkids? Your 401k accounts may look pretty good right now, and you may feel good about your retirement accounts and how much money you have in the bank, and there's a lot more at stake right now than how much we own or how much we possess. My daughter, who is in high school right now, I don't talk about my kids very much because I worry about their safety sometimes. She said to me before heading off to school this fall that she was worried about a mass shooting at her high school. How is it possible that we are taking children from their parents at the border and thinking it's okay to lock them up in cages? How is that okay? How is any of that, putting all of that together, how is that handing off to the next generation a better country? And so my sense of it is, one of the reasons why I wrote this book is that we all have to hit the pause button and think deeply about where we are as a country right now, because where things are right now is not going to hand off to the next generation a better country.
How's my time? You're good. Let me ask, because I have a question here that really picks up on what you've just said, Jim, and it's from someone in the audience. I teach my 8th graders that the press are the eyes and ears, quote, eyes and ears of the people. And that the rule of law says no one is above the law, not even the president. They read that the Constitution gives Congress the remedy of impeachment with or without removal. Yet all of my teachings seem a lie. How do I teach our young people truth and hope?
Wow. Great question.
I'm glad I'm the moderator who have to answer this. Who wants to take that?
I'm happy to take. You want to take?
You go and
You can all take it.
We can all take. We'll take whatever. I'll be very quick.
And then I have one other.
Yeah, one of the things I did for the book that I wrote is to interview a lot of really smart lawyers. And one of the things that Donald Trump's administration has proven is that the Constitution's great weakness was that the men who made it presumed that only aristocratic landed men who are white would ever be president. And so they've never built in rules and laws that prevent a president from emerging into a king. The thing they feared was a president becoming a king, and they built nothing into it to stop it. Donald Trump has proven how far you can break the Constitution, break the rules, because they're mostly not laws, they're norms. And 44 presidents just agreed to go along with the norms. So the Emoluments Clause seems like it's a pretty strict rule, but how do you enforce it? Who's gonna do it? Donald Trump's whole philosophy is, how are you gonna make me? You give a subpoena to me or anybody in my administration, even somebody who's just a friend of mine, how are you gonna make them show up? How are you gonna make me not make money off being president? If I wanna make money, if I wanna make the military pay me every day, pay me every time they travel, I'm gonna make them pay me. Who's gonna stop me? Right now, the problem in the country is the Constitution has a lot of built-in weaknesses that this president is exploiting, full stop, because he has a Congress that will let him do whatever he wants, both the Republicans who are in the club and earning and enjoying, and the Democrats who seem so afraid of seeming unreasonable that they're willing to allow Donald Trump to run over the rest of us in order not to seem unreasonable. So what I would say that this questioner should teach their children is that the one thing that autocracy fears is the people. The one thing that every politician fears is their voters. And so, I believe so much in voting. It's my main thing that I care about the most. You need to keep voting until you get enough people in that office who actually believe the Constitution should be enforced, not just fun play reading or something that you can hear on C-SPAN. And I would keep voting out every single person who will not enforce what's in that Constitution to the letter and will not make this president understand that he's Article 2, not Article 1. The power is in the House of Representatives. It was written for the people's house to have the power. And I personally would say, I don't care how much you like your representative, vote everybody out until you get someone in there that will bring this president under control.
I would just add to that, this young man who wrote, is a young man or young
This
lady
is
who wrote
the teacher, but there's
Teacher.
no indication.
She's talking about how do you have our young people have faith.
How do I teach our young people truth and hope?
I mean, I think that, listen, as Joy was saying earlier, there is no guarantee. We can't make a guarantee that the way of life that we have right now is going to remain the way of life that our children, our grandchildren are going to enjoy in this country. And what have previous generations done? What have our heroes in our previous generations done? They have had to fight for this way of life. They have had to suffer. They have had to endure. They've had to outlast to preserve and expand upon this quality of life that we have in this country. And that's what you teach our young people. If they want to have truth and hope in this country in the future, they're going to have to fight for it. And they're going to have to make sure that their parents are fighting for it and give them a hard time, give their grandparents a hard time. None of this is guaranteed. There's no passing the torch off to the next generation and things just go, just fine and dandy after that. We're going to have to fight for what we have right now. And if we wanted to get better, that is going to require some major sacrifices.
And I agree with that.
Giving up some comfort.
Maybe offer one hopeful note, which is, the way I look at it amid all this despair, is we have tectonic forces bumping up against each other. And on the one hand, we have the president and his authoritarian tendencies, and his impunity, and the passivity of the Congress, and the capture by our elites of so many societal institutions. But on the other hand, we have demographic change. We have a young generation of millennials and Generation Z that is far more progressive and woke and enlightened on issues of race, gender, LGBT rights, climate change, human rights globally. And that is very hopeful. And they're going to be almost half of our electorate in this election. And what I think of when I get depressed is every year that number creeps up, and it's an inexorable force. I mean, so those 8th graders in the classroom, are actually probably, the greatest hope that we have. And I think getting them out on the streets the way they did on Friday for the climate march, and we may have to take to the streets more. There may become a time where we need to go down to the National Mall. We need to be ready to do it.
And can I just say that one of the sort of joys of the last year for me was meeting those little Parkland kids. I raised our kid. My husband and I raised our kids mainly in Florida, and so Parkland's not that far from us. And these little middle class, mostly white kids got out there, and they are as woke as it gets. They're intersectional. They drew kids of all races around the country together. They've been more effective than any anti-gun lobby other than Moms Demand Action, which is also extremely effective. And they basically are the Sandy Hook kids older. They went through the exact same things, but those were babies, and so they couldn't really get out there and defend themselves. But these kids are old enough to speak and to tweet, and they've taken on the present. They're not afraid. They haven't learned to be afraid and intimidated. So I'm actually hopeful because younger people, my kids have made me cover climate change. They're like, when are you doing climate change on your show? Young people get it. They understand that whether it is on race, whether it is on gender identity, sexual orientation, they get it. And there are some there obviously that have fallen into the other side of it as well. But the vast majority of the next generation understands what's at stake, and they are fighting.
And I just want to build on that with one point about one of those, because we honored some of those kids, the Parkland kids, at an event we did, and I met one of them, Samantha Fuentes. Samantha had been working as a waitress. Like, that was her only extracurricular. She did not come from a wealthy family. She lived in a trailer for a lot of her growing up, and would spend all of her spare time working as a waitress. And yet within that girl, when this happened, emerged this impassioned and incredibly powerful advocate who took the stage at the March for Our Lives and at our event and, you know, was just an unleashed force. So if you think about all those 8th graders who could be that within them lies perhaps something like this, you know, that could be an unstoppable force.
I've got my timekeeper telling me to wrap. The climate may indeed be the issue, as frightening, horrifying, and all-encompassing as it is. That may be the issue that brings us together and moves us forward as a country and indeed as a world. We are, do I have 1 minute? Do I have 1 minute? Am I out of time?
Closing remarks.
Okay, excellent. So, closing remarks, rapid fire. If a young person comes to you and says, I want to be a journalist, in this moment, looking forward, let's say a college student, what's your advice for that young person? And I'm always thinking in terms of diversifying I didn't get to ask the diversity question, but I'm always thinking about diversity as we cover all of these issues we've been talking about, because that's been one of the problems in our profession.
Yes.
But what is your advice for young people thinking, and please don't say, don't.
I used to say
Go to law school. What's your advice? Joy, you first.
You know, and I do get asked this a lot, particularly by young
I'm thinking there might be some here.
college students, et cetera, who say, I want to do what you're doing. And what I always tell them is, now, because of the changes in technology, you can just go ahead and be one. I always tell people that nowadays the way to become a journalist is not necessarily I'm not down in journalism school, I love school's important, but not necessarily go to school and learn the techniques of journalism like our generation, we're told that's what you do. You need to learn a thing and write about a thing and know how to write. That's the 3 things I always tell young people. Learn a thing, specialize in a thing. If climate change is what you're passionate about, you have so many platforms right now. Write about climate change, write about, is it race, is it gender identity, whatever it is you're passionate about, write about it now. Start establishing your brand now. Everything you write on social media, everything you do establishes your brand. Do it now. Don't wait until you get offered a job. That's number 1. And the most important thing I always told my students, and I tell young people when they come up to me, learn how to write. As a former editor, I'll tell you, the hardest thing to find is somebody who can write coherently. For the love of God, we need more people learn how to write. Because if you can write and express yourself in writing, yes, talking is beneficial, but if you can write, you will never be unemployed. Because there's always a need for somebody who can write a sentence in clean, perfect, whatever it is your native language is, learn to write.
Suzanne, we're keeping it short. What is your message to young people?
I just add one thing, which is reporting. I think we need more people who are adept at digging out the facts and getting the story. Yes, you have to write, but if we don't have people who know how to investigate, who have the tricks of the trade and can get past an official who's obfuscating and hiding and dig it out the way the story on Jeffrey Epstein was broken by a local news reporter in Florida. So I think, I don't want to lose that. I think that's essential, and I hope those skills will keep somebody employed for a good long career.
I would just say if you care about journalism, then you care about the truth, and if you care about the truth, you care about this democracy, and our democracy is only as strong as those who are willing to hold it accountable.
And can I just add one more thing? You just mentioned diversity, and I'm sorry, I should have said it the first time. I know we're trying to go. We need more people.
We're going to finish on diversity.
And
I'm going to
say just one last thing. We need more people who are of color and women in media. And so what I also would say is don't be afraid to be the only black or brown person, the only Asian American, the only. Don't be afraid to be the only in the room. And when you get in the room, try to find a way to hire or bring in somebody else like you so that you get another one of you and another and another and another. We need more diversity.
Absolutely.
Bravo. I want to say thanks to these 3 brave journalists, Jim, Joy, and Suzanne, especially PEN America. And thanks, Clarice, for inviting us all here.
Yes, I was
Thank
going
you
to
all of
say,
you for supporting their work.
and thank you, Jami, for being an excellent moderator. Thank you all.